retrieves a 2-digit country code based upon the country ID provided by the client. So, all right, we're pressing ahead to practice 7-4, where we're going to go ahead and configure that new ATP database adapter connection, running through various steps to get the information from a specific table and a schema in that database. Let me go ahead and pull this out of the way. You can follow along with your activity guide. Step 1, we go to our integrations panel, to our retrieve country information, and we're going to open it back up for editing. So now we're ready to, within our design canvas, make a call right after we receive the trigger. And we'll use this new database connection ATP demo. We're going to call this get code, looking for the country code. And notice here on this basic information page, we have several options here. One is to invoke a stored procedure, which we don't have. The other is to go ahead and run a SQL statement. If we had a SQL statement that we knew, we could just paste it in here and we use that option. But we're going to walk you through how it allows you kind of to build logic for performing an operation on a table. And I almost forgot, it gave me some text for a description, which I'll paste in here in our lab guide. Basically, this retrieves a 2-digit country code based upon the country ID provided by the client. So now that we have the perform operation on the table, we have 4 different options. We're going to do a select in this case, and we'll click continue. Now we need to select which schema we're interested in, and I'm just going to type SH, which in this case allows me to find it. Stands for sales history, by the way. And then we're looking for a table, and so I can start typing in countries, table, or if I didn't know the exact name of the table, I could just start doing a search to see what tables are there. And indeed, there's that countries table, and we can simply drag that across over here, and below we click on import tables. But there are more edits to be done on this page. So once this brings this in, it gives us some options. So down below, we can obviously, while we're here, we can add or remove tables if we need to do so. We could also define parent-child database relationships, which we don't need to do in this case. But in step 10, it does talk about how we need to decide what columns that we want to retrieve. So we click this little edit link right here. And we don't need all this other information. All we need is that ISO country code. So what I'm going to do is simply select it. Whoops, I'm sorry. Select it, and that's the only thing that'll be returned, and we click continue. Now there's another area too where we need to kind of create and edit the SQL query section. So let me click in here on edit. And we see that the initial query is select country ID and country ISO code, which is from the sales history countries table. However, we need to add a where clause. So what we'll do is we're going to click on SQL edit. And we will paste in from the lab instructions that where clause. And again, this is coming from the lab instructions here on step 15. And then for the parameter, we need to identify that ID. So down here below, we're going to enter ID into that box to match the parameter we had at the top. And we click on Add New. so that it gets pasted in up here above. There we go. So there's the query and there's the selected parameter. Now we can click continue. And in this case, we really only need one record. We're looking for one ID, so I can put 1 for the maximum number of records to be fetched. Click continue again. And now that my configuration for the table operation is complete, I can click continue to move away from that pane. I'm on the summary pane now where I can review the information. That looks correct, and I can click finish. You can imagine a far more complicated use case with parent and child tables and other information, how now this helps you build that SQL statement. As always, once we see the configured invoke, we see now the new map action made available to us that we can implement. Before I do that, I'm going to click on Save to save my integration so far. Dismiss that banner, and let's go into Map the information we need for the request. So over in the sources section, as you recall, for our template parameter, we have the ID that's provided by the client. And if we look over here in our request, because we define that parameter, that's all we need over here. We just map it straight across, click validate, dismiss the banner, exit the mapper. One more time, click save to save the integration so far. And that completes the practice. We'll see you in the next video. All right, moving forward with practice 7-5, sort of continuing where we left off. Now it's time to implement the logic to go and make a request to that external REST web service that's going to be able to return the country information. So I'll follow the steps here to configure that connection. Again, in this case, we want to do it right after we call the database. So we invoked on the ATT database here to get the code. Now we can do an invoke to that REST countries external web service. And we're going to call this endpoint according to the lab instructions. They want us to call it get country info. And they gave us a nice little explanation as to what this does. So we'll paste that in there. Descriptions are always nice for reviewing. And yeah, we're getting the country information based upon this 2 digit ISO code that we have now retrieved from the database. For the relative URI, this is something that we get from the web services documentation. They require this v3.1/alpha/ and then we need to provide the code as a template parameter. So now all we have to do is configure the response. So we'll click on that to bring that page up. First, we'll review this request parameters page, and nothing changes here. The code will remain as a string, and we don't need to add any query parameters. So I click Continue. And now we're going to switch this again to a JSON sample. The website for that particular web service, I should say, we were able to save that for you. It's called the REST Countries API Response. So let me navigate over there. Bear with me. REST Countries API Response. There he is. And we just simply got that from their sample response from their website, so make it easier for you. If you want to look at it, just click on the inline menu and you can see what the format of that JSON response is going to be. Click Cancel, and of course I can click Continue to move forward, which takes me to the summary page, and I can review our information here. By the way, we didn't talk about this before, but if you ever want to do some other testing, you can actually generate a sample curl statement to map what's going on with this particular request as well, if you needed to test that separately. All right, click on Finish. It's going to add our mapper. Before we configure that, let's save our integration so far. Close the banner, and now we can implement that map action that is going to map the data that needs to be sent in for him. So we click Edit. And in this case now we get that get code response from the database. It returned, remember we decided from that countries collection and array of countries, we're actually only wanted two pieces of data, the country ID. Well, we don't need that, but we do need that country ISO code. So that's going to go over here to our template parameters, to our web service, which needs that code. We map that across, click Validate. Close the banner, exit the Map Editor, and one more time, click Save. All right, well, to wrap up this practice then, we're going to do a final implementation step of configuring the response mapping object that was provided when we first created the trigger. So beginning in step 21 and moving forward, I'm now opening this up. For editing, we're looking at that get country info response that came from the web service, execute response, response wrapper, top level array, and there's a whole bunch of data being returned to us. In the target section, if you recall the JSON object, we have some simple fields that we want to populate, and the lab instructions again is really clear as to what gets mapped to what. I'm going to follow these instructions explicitly, and looking for name common is what moves over to name. It says the CCA2 maps to this alpha 2 code, CCA3 to the alpha 3 code, capital maps to capital, and population, if I can find it. There it is. Maps to population. And area maps to area. I must have missed it somewhere. There it is. Oh, I somehow missed my population mapping earlier. I wasn't paying attention. There we go. So I got name, alpha 2 code, alpha 3 code, capital, population, area. And now for native name, it says I need to expand name and native name and English and official, and that's the one that will map to a valid value for us for a native name. And once again, for checking the mapping, we remind you how we can use the filter on both the left and right side if we want to, but really we just need to see what's mapped from the source since there's only a few objects here in the target. And when I expand that, it allows me now to see that I've got the correct values according to our requirements, and I can now see the mappings accordingly. If you're ever curious to see the full expressions, it's always interesting to go ahead and click on one of them, and you can go over here to the developer view to see the full path expression to that particular data object along the way. Of course, I can dismiss this and we can review any of those other ones as we see fit. All right, I'm going to click on Validate one more time. Dismiss the banner, close the Map Editor. We'll click Save to save our integration. And we're done with our implementation, so we'll go ahead and go back to our project page, which completes the practice. We'll see you in the next video. And for our final practice in this lab, practice 7-6, since we've completed our implementation, it's time to activate, test, and monitor. Again, I'll follow the steps, taking a look at some various use cases of various values to be returned and checking to see the trace of what happened. So we start here with the instructions. They say to go ahead and go to retrieve country information and activate it. As usual, we want to use the debug tracing level. We dismiss that banner, and to get rid of the activation and progress, we refresh to see it in the active state, which it now is. And now we're ready to test. Beginning with step 5, it tells us to go and click on Run. Since this is REST-based, we can use the REST client tester. And we have a sample ID for you to use, 52790. All right, so when we click on this, we would expect that it goes to the integration, which then goes to the database, which then retrieves the code, which then calls the external web service, and hopefully our response will line up with the United States, and indeed I've got that information to include population, area, and so forth. All right, well, let's kind of take a look at our activity stream. If you look over here, you'll notice then that we can see that the message processing when we did to the get code was initially done to the database. And let me wait for that to refresh here. Let me click refresh. There we go. So we got the call, the response from the database, which return the country ID and the country code. Notice everything is in an XML format. And then later down here, we can see when we vote on the country info, the message, the data that was sent, the data that was responded, that was in the response. And so all this always allows us to review the information. The other thing that's interesting that we didn't talk about before, now's a good time to, if I don't want to go and track all the instances, but I'm looking at just now tracking this particular instance, this will take me directly to that instance's page where I can see the track of what happened. Again, because there's no conditional logic or no loops, this is pretty kind of boring to look at, but you can see how quickly it is to go back and be able to see a particular instance directly from the tester. Now, the lab instructions beginning in step 11 says we can try some other codes. Here is one for Canada. I'll paste that in and we'll click Run. And sure enough, we got back Canada, and I've got a code for India, so let's try that one. And there's the information for India. Now, in the lab instruction, it says to go ahead and run a test with an invalid country ID, and it gives us an example of one, 99999. And this one's kind of interesting because it does return an internal error. And the reason for that is, and the lab instructions explain why we get some error processing problem, it's because we make a call to the database, but when we don't receive anything from the database, we're not checking to see if we got anything. We're just going ahead and making a call to the remote web service. So that remote web service, since they're getting no code, are giving us an error response. And that's where the response came from. As you can see right here, it received an error because it didn't get the appropriate information to it. So the reason I bring that up, and the reason we have it in our lab instructions, is that you need to really implement some additional logic if you want to do error handling. Now, we have a later lab exercise to do fault handling, but I'll quickly fast forward down to this bonus challenge. For those of you who do have access to the lab environment, I put this solution, if you will, in the solutions project, but we give you a hint for what you might want to do for a use case such as this, where you would actually check to see what's returned from the database and then conditionally call the external web service if you actually received a decent code. Otherwise, you wouldn't make that call and you would send some sort of a response back to the client that's a bit more meaningful. So anyway, I just thought I'd kind of throw that out there. Let's quickly wrap up our shutting things down here. They're asking us to go ahead and close down, head back over to the observe page. I'm sorry, to the design page. Quickly, let's go to the observe. We can see the instances that have just run, and we can see those primary identifiers. By the way, if I wanted to return to that one, I could now see visually where that error had occurred. So anyway, let's go back to our design page. According to step 16 and forward, we're supposed to deactivate this thing. You should know how to do that by now. Click deactivate, close the banner, refresh the page, and we're back to a configured state. And so quick summary of what we did in this exercise here. We essentially built a REST adapter interface for an integration that provides an abstraction to retrieve country information when the client only has a particular country ID that's being stored in a database or for the lookup. And so if you will revisit what we learned, one of the most important ones and the focus of this lab was about that AT adapter connection that builds the SQL statement for us. I mentioned in one of the previous videos, but now I'll kind of bring that up for you again. We provide this additional information that you might find very useful, this PDF that's in your resources folder for the labs. And essentially what it does, it kind of explains a lot of information, for example, about creating the connection, adding the connection, using the various properties, as well as other common patterns that can be implemented with the transaction processing adapter. All right, well, that concludes this Lab 7 practice. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome to the overview for Lab 8, creating a SaaS to SaaS integration using a lookup. And that really is the focus then on this particular set of lab practices, showing you how to create a lookup and then implement logic to leverage that lookup, in this case between two SaaS applications. So there are several steps involved here as we learn more about how to use a lookup, it's essentially a domain value map. We're going to reuse two connections that we've already created in earlier labs, the Oracle CRM, which is the Oracle CX Cloud, and Oracle Right Now, which is the Oracle Service Cloud. And essentially, the use case is fairly straightforward. We're going to design the integration to receive a new account business object containing information about the organization that was sent from the CX Sales Cloud. Then with the lookup, we need to map one piece of data involving an address type, and you'll see how that's done. And as before, we'll need to leverage a SOAP client application. Again, SOAP UI will be what I'm demonstrating. And of course, you're going to be expected to leverage that SOAP-based message in your design. So just real quick recap, we're reusing a CX Sales and B2B Service Cloud trigger adapter connection, and reusing the Oracle Service Cloud Right Now invoke connection. The key focus on this one will be doing an address lookup that we're going to first configure and then use within the integration. Therefore, the prerequisites are that we've already done Lab 1, setting up the project. We've already done Lab 4, 5, and 6, because several of those resources will be then reused as we do these set of practices. We'll see you in the next video. So continuing on now, practice 8-1, where we're going to focus on creating that lookup first. So if you will, follow along with me. I'll move this out of the way. And the first steps are to go to the lookups panel. So I need to re-enter my project. And over here in the lookups panel, over here on the left, we click the add button. So we're creating one. And we want to name this address type. And I'll click create. So beginning with step 5, we're changing the and indicating whether the domain name should just be something that I edit and type in, which we can do, or just use a domain name associated with an adapter type. In this case, we're going to use the adapter type for domain 1 and look for that CX Sales Cloud. So anytime an adapter of this type is being used, it has similar kind of logic. There's that one. And then we'll do the same thing for domain 2, but this one will be replaced with the Right Now adapter. So I'll type right. Yeah, there it is. So that gets us started. Then down below, so far we have one row of data. We're going to add 2 more rows by clicking this once and then clicking this again. And now I have 3 rows of data that I can populate. So under CX Sales Cloud, we're populating 1, 2, and 3 for values that could come from there that we need to now map over to billing. So we're creating the domain value relationship, shipping, and business. All right. For step 11, it just simply says to save it. If you're good, go ahead and save it, which we will. Close the banner. Now that it's configured, we click the go back arrow, and we can see our address type lookup in a configure state. That's it for the practice. We'll see you in the next video. Moving now to practice 8.2. Here we're going to go ahead and now create a new integration from scratch and then configure the trigger. Once again, I'll move this out of the way and you can follow along. Task 1 says go to the integrations panel and click to add yet another integration. This time we're going to call it create OSC organization. Well, first let me click create and then application, and then there's the name for it. Click create. And the trigger, once again, this time will be the Oracle CRM trigger connection. The lab instructions say we should call it create org. And we can go ahead and click continue. So again, there's two choices when configuring a request. Either they're going to be supplying a business object, or it's going to be associated with an object with a business event. In this case, we're selecting business object, and it's account object that's going to be sent in with the request. So we click continue. All right, here on the configured response page, this time we're also going to return another account business object, obviously filled with more data once it goes back to the client. Our summary page confirms our choices. We click finish. And we're now returned to the integration design canvas. And of course, once again, the mapper is now ready to be mapped once at the end, I should say. It's available for us, but we can't really implement that yet until we have called something else first. So we'll click save, close the banner, and beginning with step 14, it's reminding us about defining the business identifier. So in this case, for the business identifier field within the account, we're going to look for the organization name and use that for the unique business identifier. And we'll rename it so it's not so long. We'll just simply call it org name according to the instructions. Click away from here to save the mapping and close the panel, and then save here to save the integration. All right, with that, I'll close the banner. I can now go back out of our integration canvas back to our project design page, and that concludes the practice. We'll see you in the next video. Okay, moving ahead to practice 8-3, where we're going to now implement the logic to actually create that new organization in the Oracle Service Cloud. Again, we'll be leveraging the lookup a little bit later for one of these mappings. But first, let's see what's going to be different. This time on the Service Cloud, we're going to be using a CRUD create operation as opposed to the right now object query language. So follow along with me as I go through these tasks. First task is here on the integrations panel. We've clicked in and gotten into our create organization, and we hover just below that trigger, and we're going to add and invoke to Oracle right now. Now the name for this endpoint, we've been asked to call it create OSC org. And then as before, notice we can do one or more operations in a batch, or in this case, once again, a single operation. Instead of the right now object query language call, this time we're using a CRUD operation, and indeed, since we're creating an organization, we'll use create. And now we're looking for the organization business object. If I just start typing org, there it is. I choose it, click it, and move it across and click continue. All right, our summary is pretty straightforward and easy. Let's click finish. And once again, obviously every time you configure and invoke, you're going to get a corresponding map action so that you can map data to that invoke call. Let's go ahead and save this, and then we can now enter the mapper to do the mapping. I'll click here to edit. Now, the data that we have available to us at this point is the account object that was passed in, so we expand that over there. Over in the target area, we can expand that organization. And what we're looking to is to drag the organization name, which is right here at the top. And we need to locate the name element, which is right here. So we're going to simply map that across to there. And then according to the instructions, we have other things to address. So over in the target section, we need to expand addresses and then expand typed address list node. And now we're giving instructions within this scope to be able to now map some data from over here. And the instructions are to map the city element. Let me go down to where their city is. There we go, way down here to the city. Next we need to drag country to country name. Notice it won't go into country since that's a higher level node. We actually have to go to the element country name. Then postal code goes to postal code, and address line 1 right up here goes to the target street element. And there's a little bit of a warning here that we're using the target from the account itself. There's actually another other elements that are a child of account primary address, and so we've got to be careful that we're not using that. That's way down here. Yeah, right here, primary address. So if you're doing the lab yourself, be careful. There's other similar elements, but they're a child of primary address. We're not using that. We're using these that I've mapped here so far. All right, so now we're ready to, on the target side, we want to look for address type. There it is right here to locate that element underneath that typed address list. So we found that. And in the case, if you expand it, you'll see that there's a name element within that address type. So that's the one that we need to highlight, and that's the one we're going to apply our lookup to. And this is a little bit tricky, so watch me do it carefully. The instructions walk you through it, but until you see it done, it's maybe a little bit confusing. So I'm looking to apply a lookup function that's going to get the source from something over here. To do that, I'm going to expand the integration cloud and get the lookup value function and put it onto that name element. Notice what that does here. It immediately launches this wizard, if you will, for first of all selecting which lookup. Of course, we only have one, so I select it. And then I advance here to select the source and target columns. Well, we know that the target here is Oracle Service Cloud right now. Unfortunately, the acronym for the other one, the CX Sales Cloud, is OSC. So make sure you click right now for the right that has either billing, shipping, or business. And the source will come from something over here that will be coming as a value of 1, 2, or 3. All right. Now, which of those should be the default? We're going to type in billing will be the default value. And now when you advance to the end, you'll notice that these values are checked already for the function itself, with one exception. The source value hasn't yet been determined. So what we will get is this DMV lookup value function into our expression box down here. So when I click done, notice it shows the function there, but it doesn't show where the source value placeholder, that's just a placeholder. It doesn't show the value that we need to populate. So we're gonna make a space there, leave the cursor there, and up above, what we're going to be looking for is the account address element attribute 1. So there's that address element attribute 1. That gets pasted into there. So now the lookup function is complete. I can click here to save it. And now you can see the mapping goes to the function, which now supplies for this name. All right, we're almost done. We'll click the X to get out of that expression editor. Finally, over here in the target section, step 37, we're looking under that typed address list, and we need to specify a value for this action attribute. So when we click on there, right click to create node, we'll get an expression box once again, and the instructions say we need to put the value of add in there. So type double quote, add double quote, click on save, and we can see that text value now is provided for that action. So at this point, it's time to double check the mapping. Let's close the box. Let's close this down so it gives us more room. And for the filter options, let's now apply that to both sides, all mapped on the left and all that's mapped on the right. And when you expand appropriately to get rid of the dotted lines, let's see, I got one there, got one there. And now let's get rid of the dotted lines on this side. Let's see, good there. So now it's an opportunity for me to just kind of double check that we actually got the right elements on the left mapping to the right elements on the right when you're following the instructions. So again, if you're not familiar with using the mapper, it's always helpful to just review. The other thing we want you to do in the instructions, talk about this a lot, we're going to be making a test request to the service, to the integration service. Therefore, when we populate the account object from the SOAP UI client, these are the places where we need to populate values. So later when we have instructions on telling you to put values in the account object, it's going to be those same locations. Sort of pay attention to that so that when you do your testing, you're actually populating these values and not some other value in that big, large account XML schema. All right, we're just about done. We'll click on Validate. Close that. And we click the Go Back arrow to exit the mapper, and save to save the integration. That concludes this practice. We'll see you in the next video. All right, moving forward to practice 8-4. In this practice, we're just simply going to work on implementing the response mapping. Let's get started. So now it's time to go into that mapper that provides a response back to the client. We open it up for editing. You can either double click it or do as I did, just click edit. So now we have more sources. In this case, we're looking for the information from the create OSC org response of right now. Expand that, then expand organization, and then the first sequence, and then ID, because we need now that ID for our first mapping. Under target and account, there's a party ID element that needs to be mapped over there. So we take that one according to the instructions, and now we need to click the validate button for that ID. That's all we're going to return, because the client just simply needs to know you created an organization. Great. What is the party ID of that organization name that I look to add so that I can have it for my reference? And that's all they need. So we click validate. We go back to exit the mapper. Click save. And then we click go back to exit the integration design canvas and back to the project page. And that's it for this practice. See you in the next video. And we're now ready for the final practice of this lab, practice 8-5. Now that the implementation is completed, it's time to activate and do some testing. Let's get started. So as before, we go to the Create OSC Organization and click Activate. We want to ensure that we're in the debug tracing level. Click Activate again. Close the banner. To refresh this activation in progress. We click this refresh icon, and now we're in an active state. So at this point, as before with SOAP-based interfaces, instead of directly opening up a test client, we need to run details for the WSDL associated with for testing in a third-party SOAP client. And as before, we're going to, of course, use SOAP UI for that. Let me bring that over here so we can kind of take a look. And in SOAP UI, I still have my old project in, so I'm going to close that from Lab 6. And we're going to follow the instructions to go ahead and set up a new SOAP project. And again, I need this WSDL to paste into here. And we're going to call this one OIC Lab 8. And as before, it only takes just a moment to introspect that WSDL, and we can now see if we double click this request 1 what the format of the request is supposed to be. And as expected, we have that account object where we need to populate one or more data values. So the lab instructions indicate the things that need to be populated. Let's go ahead and first click the Auth tab. We know we're going to need it anyway to add our authentication. And since this is the third time we're doing it, this should be coming pretty familiar to you. I need to paste in my username and password to be able to access the integration at runtime. And as before, we right-click to add that token, and we're all set. It's the security header is there. Now if we go to our lab instructions, it explains essentially, now that we have the credentials there for invoking a request, need to populate some of these values, replacing some of these question marks with real values. The first one that's critical is the organization name. And here's where we recommend you create it. We're actually going to create an organization over there. So the recommendation is you use something that's unique. I'm going to use my last name, underscore Aura 002, because that was my student number. And then I'm going to put org1. This allows me now to have a unique name, and if I want to create another organization, I would use that same kind of prefix. Now, the next thing is pretty important is that address element attribute 1. So we're going to scroll down much, much further. And it's way down here. Here we go. Address element attribute 1 at this upper level. And if you recall, this is what we're mapping to the lookup. It's either going to be a 1, 2, or a 3. If it's 1, it's going to map to billing. If it's 2, it's mapping to shipping. If it's 3, it's going to map over to whatever that third one was. I forgot off the top of my head. For this use case, I'm going to map one of the valid ones, 1 or 2. So I'm going to choose 2. Since the instructions tell me to do that. And then down just below that, address line 1 needs a legitimate address. We're going to give you 101 Main Street is what we'd like you to type in here. And then for a city, again, it's got to be a valid, can't just be any characters. So I'm going to put in my home city of Tampa. You can put in your city if you like. But for country, don't go too far off. It's got to be a valid country code. And to be safe, put US in there to be safe. And then a postal code needs to be 5 digits. I'm putting my home zip code. Now, technically, you can use other values, but my warning is you'll get some weird errors if there's something here in the country that doesn't align for right now when it receives this. So just put US and you know you'll be safe. So the lab instructions remind you of what should be in there. Please don't use just any arbitrary fields if you're doing this on your own. All right, now that we've put the values in, let's execute the request right here. And at this point, once we get a response back, indeed, the organization has been actually created in the Service Cloud. If I click on XML view, I can see that the party ID, the organization ID, the ID of that organization has been returned as 293. And remember that, because we can create some additional organizations if we want. In fact, that's what the instructions here beginning with step 20 says to do. Go ahead and try something else, like create another organization. Let me scroll back to the top, and we'll call this org2, and we'll submit another request. And sure enough, we have another unique organization in there, and there's its unique party ID. Now, the other thing we want to try here, instead of using 1 or 2 for mapping of the value, let's go back down to that address attribute 1. So if we used 1, we know that that would map okay. But if we use 3, the reason why we added this there, this 3 maps to a value that right now doesn't recognize. Right now doesn't recognize that third mapping. We just added that on purpose so that you could see what a runtime error might look like later when you're monitoring this. So try to create another organization. Use 3 as the attribute. I'm going to go ahead and try to create org3, and 3 for the address type. And what we're going to see when we make this request, hopefully, if this logic is correct, sure enough, I'm getting a request fault. Essentially, the complaint from right now got populated back, and they just don't like this lookup name called business. So they wanted either billing or shipping. They don't know what a business is. We just added that to the lookup just to give us an idea of what an error might look like. So now that we've done all of that, let's kind of move this out of the way and continue on back to our project homepage. Let me dismiss this here and click on the Observe button to see what happened recently in the last hour. Sure enough, there are my 3 calls. Notice one of them shows as errored. When we go to the Instances page, here's now we can see specifically which each of those won. And so if I click on either one of the first 2, let's just go to the second one here. I can see all green for the mapping. I can see the information if I want to expand any here with the invoke and what was returned in a response. If I go back out though and look at one of the errored one right here, here's where I can see that indeed that invoke involved an error. And then if I click in to examine that a little bit closer, I can see that indeed that same error. It says, well, you got an invalid ID called business, and we don't know what that is. Well, again, we mapped that. We intentionally did that data mapping, and we provided for the name, we provided business. Where did that come from? That came from the lookup. And in this case, it's just an invalid value that we purposely put it into the lookup to do the testing. Let's scroll back out and go look at one of the valid ones. And again, when you could see that data mapping, when you provide shipping or the other one, then it takes that and it's okay. All right. Well, that pretty much gets us towards the end of this practice. If I can go back out and then head over to the design page, the instructions, once again, beginning in step 28, asks us to go ahead and deactivate our integration, which I will do. Click deactivate, dismiss here, and refresh to show back into the configured state. So as always, we have a little bit of summary to remind you of what got accomplished in this particular lab exercise. And this indeed concludes Lab 8. All right, welcome to the overview for Lab 9, creating a schedule integration, loading data into Oracle HCM Cloud. And as you can see by the estimated time, this is a bit longer one as it contains 9 separate practices. And if I can sort of summarize a little bit of what we're seeing here, of course, you have the opportunity to read the activity guide yourself, word for word. We're actually going to do very little implementation. We're going to be mostly exploring the implementation that has already been done, because in practice 9-4, we're importing a pre-built integration and look at all the ways and look at how it was configured. But in order to use that and actually activate it and test it, there'll be a few things we need to do for setting up, such as creating a new FTP adapter connection. The first time we'll see that being done to an external FTP server. Going to be adding a file over to the FTP. We're using an FTP client to that FTP server. We'll also need to create a connection for Oracle HCM Cloud. And then once we import that, in practice 9-5 and 9-6, we're going to be examining a lot of information associated with this use case using HCM data loader, DAT files, native XSD schemas, as well as looking at the implementation actions that are part of this create pending workers integration. At a high level, we're looking to retrieve a file, then generate and essentially create the DAT file needed for HCM. It needs to be zipped up and then uploaded to the UCM, and then make sure that we then execute to start an HCM data loader job. Now the lab instructions in here in the overview provide a little bit more information and backdrop as to what are pending workers and how they can be imported in bulk. Also talks the notion of why you would want to use a scheduled integration to process this file, as well as provide a little bit of an overview of the steps that we're going to be seeing along the way. So as you can see, a lot of different steps. We're also going to do along the way, make sure we set up an FTP client. We're going to use FileZilla and show you how to download and use that if you don't already have an FTP client that you'd prefer to use, which is fine. And then, of course, along the way, we're going to learn about all the integration actions that are involved with this. So this is a fairly large lab, even though you're not actually implementing the integration. You're going to be learning a lot about a real world sort of use case. Good news is the only prereq is that you've already done lab 1 to set up a project. Everything else is going to be brought in brand new. All right, that's it for the overview. We'll see you in the next video. All right, here in practice 9.1, we're going to start off with creating an FTP adapter connection to a specific external FTP server that we have staged in your lab environment for you. Once again, the very first step is to go ahead and find out the IP address and the credentials for accessing the FTP server. And again, that is on your lab tab to simulate what your lab tab will look like. Down here below at the lowest part of your lab tab, under Public Cloud Instance Info section, there's where you'll find the IP address for that FTP server, and those are the username, password, credentials that'll be used to access that server. So I'm going to be using those. You'll have, when you have your own environment, you'll have probably the same credentials, because those don't change too much, but there'll be a unique IP address where your FTP server has been mounted for use for your particular lab provisioning. So let's pull that out of the way, and we're going to get started here with task number 2 to go ahead and configure the connection. So we start off here with clicking on adding a new connection here in our project, and this will be an FTP type. So if I type that, I can find the adapter, and they want us to call it FTP demo, which we will. And as you can notice with FTP adapters, there's no notion of a trigger role. It is only the invoke role, so nothing to select there. We click on create. And now it's time to configure how to connect to that host address. Well, first thing we need is that IP address. I just showed you that a second ago. I'm going to paste that in here. And since this is a secure FTP server, the server port, and we give it to you in the lab instructions, is 22. Then under optional properties, we need to now indicate that yes, this is a secure FTP connection. And while we're here, notice that there's a whole lot of other optional properties that we could provide if we're using SSL certificates, if we're concerned about the operating system being Unix or Windows. A lot of these things might be required in your real world scenarios. The documentation covers that all of these quite extensively on what they're for and when you might need to use them. For our use case, all we need is that SFTP connection saying yes, so I can now close that up. And we move on to the FTP server access policy as our security policy, which is required a username and password. We don't need more sophisticated like public key or multi-level authentication for our use case. So now all we need to do is paste in that username and password. Let's do that now. Easy enough. And I can go ahead and show that to you because I've already provided for that. And that's really it. Click on test. It attempts to make a connection to the server. And obviously that was successful. Close the banner and click save. I'll close that banner. We see that we're in a configured status. I'll exit the connection page, and here we can see it and the configured status. All right, that's it for this practice. We'll see you in the next video. All right, now here in practice 9-2, it's entitled that we're installing FileZilla, but then there's a note, you don't have to install it if you already have it, nor do you have to have the latest version to test these integrations. If you've already got FileZilla or any other FTP client, if you're doing these practices yourself, you can skip these instructions altogether. But since not everybody has that, we wanted to at least set up a baseline to let you know how you can do these labs yourself, if depending on what you, not knowing what you might have on your machine already. So obviously I've already got mine installed, but I want to at least start out showing you what the instructions are leading you to. If I open this up in another browser tab at the FileZillaProject.org, you'll notice right away there's two quick links for downloading. One is for the server, which I don't need, or the client, which you would need if you don't have a client already. So when you click on that for all platforms, it recognizes that my machine is Windows, of course, and then I can download the installer. When I click on that, the instructions walk through, remind you that you really don't need any of these other, you don't need the Pro or the one with the command line interface, or you don't really need even the manual. So all you need to do is just download this basic FileZilla edition. You'll get an executable in your download, and you can install it from there. All right, so with that said, let's go back to our instructions. That's all we're walking you through here, and we kind of let you know what you're going to see when you do a download. Now, once it's been downloaded, part of this practice is to go ahead and set yourself up a connection to that same FTP server that we set a connection to the moment before. Also, this is pretty important. In fact, if you don't know how to configure FTP or proxy settings and you're on a VPN, this won't work. So coincidentally, I happen to be on the VPN right now to my Oracle VPN. I'm going to simply disconnect from that so we don't have to be distracted with it. So I'm disconnecting from the VPN as we speak. Trust me, I just I just disconnected my Cisco client, as you can see. And now I can do this, the remaining of these steps here. So the very first step says to make sure that I've got my, here it is, I've got my FileZilla open. And let me, again, I'm going to follow these instructions as to how to connect to that same FTP server. So let me move that out of the way. And first thing it says that I will need to put the IP address in here, that same IP address. All right. And then that same username and password, user1, and welcome 1234. And of course, then that port is 22. And if you click on Quick Connect, assuming you're off the VPN, it's going to work out. Also, since it's the first time you're connecting, you're going to be asked to trust the host. Click on Always Trust, and it quickly does connect and puts you into the user1 home directory. I can see someone else is using this server and set up something with OPC. Obviously, we don't have permission to that one, but we do have permission to user1. So the lab instructions indicate that we need to create our own subdirectory. Now that we're there, some unique subdirectory, because other learners are going to be using this environment at the same time. So rather than putting all your resources directly there, create a subdirectory using your initials and your ORA number, your student number. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to follow the instructions and say, yep, let's create a new directory. I'll call it DM, those are my initials, and ORA 002. There we go. And so what we're asking is all the work you do when you're putting files in or you're looking for files, read in there, and then depending on when you're doing your lab exercises, you might see other students doing work in there. And that's really it. The other option you might have to using this again is to create some shortcuts to get there, but for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to be here. The other thing I'll draw your attention to is if you haven't done it already, you may want to navigate to where your resources folder is. In fact, I'm going to go to the one that I'd set up here for these demos right there. So the resources folder, that same resources folder that you had downloaded back in Lab 1 has all the resources that we're going to need, and later on we'll tell you which ones you need to put over here into the directory. All right, that concludes this practice. We'll see you in the next video. Moving ahead to practice 9-3, we're simply going to create now a connection to another Oracle SaaS application, Oracle HCM Cloud. Once again, I'll be following the steps. Before I do, I want to just draw your attention to other information you'll need. This time, you're looking under the Lab tab, back under Fusion Credentials, and just like we did earlier with the CX Sales Cloud, we'll be looking for that URL, the Fusion URL, and we'll need the HCM credentials and the HCM password. So I'll be using that when I create my connection. Let's move this out of the way and get started. So we click plus to create a new connection. We'll search for HCM. There's Oracle HCM Cloud. And the instructions say we're going to simply call it Oracle HCM. And once again, we'll use both the trigger and invoke role. Although for this particular lab it's going to be used in the invoke role. That's okay. You can have both. And then now we need that URL. So let's paste that in. And notice while there's other policies for OAuth authentication code or using PG key support, we don't need PGP key support for these exercises, nor do we have any certificates loaded in for these labs. And we certainly haven't set this up for using authorization code credentials. So for simplicity, it's easy to just simply use username, password, and I'll use those credentials, those HCM credentials, for connecting to this both at design time and at runtime. Let me paste in that password and verify that I pasted it in without any extra spaces or whatever. Clicking test, and as the lab instructions remind you, it can take a few seconds for this to be tested. All right, that tested successfully. Same thing with saving it. That can take a little bit of time as well. And there we go. I have my confirmation banner, and as you can see, it went from the draft stage to the configured state. And all we need to do now is exit out of here. We can see that the connection has been added to our project. And that concludes this practice. We'll see you in the next video. All right, moving on to practice 9-4. Here's where we're going to import that already implemented and configured integration that we're providing for you, and it's in your resources folder that you've already extracted earlier on. So we'll follow the instructions here, and I'll point out a couple of extra things along the way. Let me move this out of the way. We're going to our integrations panel, and this time when we click on plus, instead of creating a new one, we're importing an IAR file, integration archive. So now I need to navigate to that folder that has those resources. There we go. And when you go to that folder, since it's looking for IAR files, it's about the only thing that shows up. So you bring that in and click import. So when I dismiss that banner, notice it just brings it in. It's already pre-configured. It's ready to go. However, what happens when an integration comes in, it has names of dependencies. It's looking for an Oracle HCM Cloud adapter type connection called Oracle HCM. It's also looking for an FTP adapter connection called FTP demo. Well, fortunately, we created those just a moment ago. But what if we hadn't? Or what if we named them differently? What would happen? Well, what would happen is that you would need to double check or change things in the configure. So we're showing this little feature here. In configure, this says, okay, well, it's configured with HCM and FTP demo, these two. They're in a configured status, but what if I had misnamed them? In other words, what if I had other connections? For example, I can't really show you, but if I could click replace and say, well, no, it's not that it's not that one, it's another one. So I could actually point to a different FTP adapter connection, or I could point to a different Oracle HCM Cloud of that type if they were named differently in this environment, and I could swap them out or replace them here. Or if for whatever reason these were not yet configured, they were in a draft stage, I could click here, which would take me directly to the edit page to make that work. So the purpose of the configuration editor is to make sure that, especially when you import an integration, that the connections it's expecting to refer to are the same, the same ones that you want to use, that their names are there. And if they're not there, then of course it's going to give you an opportunity to swap them out. All right, enough of that demonstration. I'll back out of there. The next thing we want to look at here is the property values. Now we have again in the lectures we talked about integration properties, and so to view them, if they exist, I can click here to see what those property values are. And for this implemented integration, it shows that there is an FTP directory property that's been defaulted to this value, which is not going to be good for you. You're going to need to change that. I'm going to show it right now. You can't do it. I'll show you later how that's going to be changed and when we're going to do it. The other one is for what we call an admin email, which we have a dummy email address here. Later, you're going to replace that value when you get ready to do some activation here. We'll show you to be instructed how to change these values as well. So I'll click cancel to get out of that pane. The next thing we want to do is go into the integration and open it in view only mode. Again, if you click on this link, it's going to take you into edit mode. Well, I don't want to do that. So the idea here is I can click on view, and then in view mode I can see that this is a schedule based integration that starts here. And when I click on that element, notice here I can click to view either the schedule definition or the schedule parameters. That's what we just did here with the view. So under schedule parameters, those have been defined as a person's file name with a default value, and then also a zip file name with a default value. Guess what we got? We're later, when we test and execute a run, we're going to be instructed to change those at their appropriate time as well. All right, finally, the business identifiers icon. Remember, every integration has to have a business identifier, and here's where you can notice that we have two of them. We have one called start time, and if we click over here, we can see that this is the actual start time that the integration will begin, which comes from here. And then the other one is going to be the file name that's being read, and that comes from that, if you recall, it comes from that parameter that we looked at a moment ago. All right, so that gets us started over there. And in a later practice, we're going to go ahead and examine all of these 12 actions and what they do and how they were configured and what the logic is behind them, which will come up really soon. For now, that ends this practice. We'll see you in the next video. All right, here for practice 9-5, before we look at the details of the implementation of the integration itself, we need a kind of understanding more about HCM data loader files, or HDL format compatibility with what we call these DAT format files. And essentially we'll also look at the format of the XML file that's going to be used as the source later for our use case. So let's start with the DAT file. We actually have this file staged for you in the resources folder. So again, just a bit of a reminder. Let me open this up and bring this in. If you open up the worker, the worker HDL file, you'll see that it is a schema, native schema file. And just for now, I'm just going to open it with Notepad, so you can take a look at it. If you recall from the lecture we had on native file format types, this is yet another example of one of those where we defined a whole bunch of data that's needed to take something that is perhaps a CSV format or other native format and relate it to essentially an XML addressable type of file. Notice the terminated types are either pipe in this case or end of line, and all these various element names. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this because you can read this on your own. Let me move this out of the way. But to understand how it's going to be generated, when you look at the schema element, you'll notice that it defines global schema attributes as well as a similar schema element for NXT schemas when you build HDL objects. You can see them here. Down as an example for the worker data element, it's defining objects and child objects that are required to load the business object. And there's additional elements such as object label for example, with the worker data, there's worker label, and then associated worker object element, which inserts a merge line. So as an example, when you look at the worker label element, this adds the names of the fields within the metadata line, as you can see here. Each business object will require its own label element. So again, if you look at an example here on the worker business object, you can kind of see the various elements provided by that, as well as how they're terminated. So the other file we wanted you to look at, so that's how the schema was built to create the HDL. The source file, the file that we're going to upload to our FTP server, comes from some, theoretically source application. There's a format for that, this person's example file, and you can open up in your resource folder and look at this more closely yourself. But here's where you'll see now it's just broken down with one or more persons. So we have their personal information, we have their work information, and so forth, and there can be one or more people added to this. And then finally, the all person schema is then the schema that defines this example file that we're going to be using when we upload data accordingly. So as you can see in the next practice, we're going to examine then how the incoming schema XML documents and how the outgoing created DAT worker schema is going to be used in the create pending workers integration. So I encourage you to look at these files more closely yourself, either before the next practice or even after the end of this whole lab exercise to help understand that a bit further. All right, this concludes the practice. We'll see you in the next video. All right, it's now time for practice 9-6, where, again, not a lot of implementation work to do per se, but we do want you to understand how this integration was built and what the various actions work like. So I'm going to be advancing through the tasks and kind of walking you through then this integration so that you can learn more about it. Let me bring this out of our way. And let's begin. We're in the integrations panel. We're looking at the integrations, and we're going to click on edit just so that we can see things better. Using view mode kind of works, but it's easier to see things edit. If you do the same thing, we're just going to caution you not to change anything or edit anything along the way. So again, we're back at the top here. If we double click this schedule element, again, we're getting back to those schedule parameters. And what we wanted to show to you, if you need to create a schedule parameter that's going to be used somewhere within the scope of the integration, it's really easy to create a new one. You just literally click on plus, give it some sort of a name, and then maybe a description that helps describe what that parameter is. And then here you have the opportunity to define what a default value would be. I could put my name if I wanted to. Sure. So anyway, it's really that straightforward. It's easy to create these, and then then you can use them and access them, assign them, change their values when it's configured for a runtime run, and easy to add another one. So we're not going to need these additional schedule parameters, so I'm going to delete that there. And delete this one I just added because it's not part of our configuration. And we'll move on. So moving on, of course, it thinks I made changes, but obviously we're not going to actually make any physical changes to the original design. So let's move on down to the global variable icon. Again, this is another type of parameter, if you will, but not a schedule parameter, but a special type of variable. And when you expand global variables, you also see a tab for integration properties. Now, remember in our lectures, we talked about the difference between a schedule parameter, a global variable, and an integration property. It can get a little bit confusing, but that's okay. The integration properties, as I showed you earlier, then two of them have already been defined with default values here and here. But if show you how easy it is to create new ones. You simply define a name for it, same thing with a description, and same thing with a default value. Let me go ahead and delete that. Alrighty, so to click outside the pane, we can close that. Let's now take a look to see how the XML input file is loaded in and downloaded into OIC. We'll skip over this map action because what happened next is we configured this read file from FTP connection. So this is using that FTP adapter connection. We gave it a name, provided some sort of description. When I click on continue, you can see that we chose the download file operation in the binary mode. Left the input directory blank because that's going to be mapped in dynamically, as well as the file name that's going to be mapped into the directory. All we had to do is define, well, where is the download directory, where is the VFS directory internally, virtual file system directory, where we're going to stage that. We just kind of gave it a name. Notice in this case there's no unzipping or PGP encryption to do, and that's pretty much it. So that's how that was configured. Let me click cancel. Once that was configured, now the map action shows what needed to be mapped. As we just noticed in the download request, we need a file name and a directory. So where do we download from, and what is the file name? Well, guess what? The file name comes as that parameter that we provided, that person's file name, where we're going to be updating a little bit later. And one of the integration properties included the FTP directory that we're working with. So again, we're going to show you how to populate those when the time is right. So moving ahead. All right, so moving ahead, we have now a stage file action. So we've downloaded the file, but it's not in memory yet. It's only in a virtual file system. So let's go ahead and move forward to the stage file read file operation. So now we'll take a look at this stage file action, and when I go in there, we can see quickly as it loads. We called it read file. We could named it anything we want, but the purpose of this is to bring that file into memory and then define its structure based upon a specific schema. So in this case, using the read entire file operation, we instead of pointing to a file reference, we indicate the file name, which is from the download response. All right, so when we read the file from the FTP server, the download response included under ICS file and properties the name of the file. So that's the name of the file, and that's the directory that it's located in. And then from there, we just simply finish out the configuration for the stage file, and now that's brought into memory. Now notice the next action is to write the file. So I'm going to skip over the mapper. The next action that was added was a stage file write action. I need to create a file, right? We're going to use a schema to essentially assign a DAT file compatible with the HCM data loader. And let's take a look at how this is configured. We chose the write file operation. Here we just made up a file name. We're going to call it worker.dat. And we just made up a directory location called worker output. That's where the file is going to be placed once it's created. And then notice then it needs to know the structure. We say, yep, there's a schema for that. We have a schema for you. You've already looked at that. That's that worker-HDL schema, and we're selecting the worker data schema element. So with that in place, let's cancel. Now we can look at the mapper, and this is where all the work was done in the implementation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify this just a little bit by filtering just the fields that are mapped so it looks a little bit less ominous, although it's still going to look ominous. So remember, this is from the stage file action, the read file response. It brought it into memory using that all persons schema, which included various schema elements to include the person's personal information and work information. So here's the source of all our data, and here's how all of them got mapped over here for the worker, for the person name. And notice that some of these fields are just a direct mapping. For example, the date of birth just simply got mapped right across. Some of these, though, are, I want to say hard-coded, but they were just basically the text, in this case HRC SQL loader. So whoever did the mapping had to know all of what was required to be able to build the appropriate HDL file. And as you can see, there's a lot of data elements that needed to be mapped, including various metadata information for these labels that just simply brought in those string values. So you see, if you had to do this yourself and we had a lab exercise where you're doing this from scratch, you'd be following a lot of lab instructions to do all these mappings and data assignments. We're trying to focus more so on how the logic of this goes rather than having you go through an exercise of mapping one data element at a time. So you can see why we did that. All right, so now let's recap. We brought the file in from the server into the virtual file system. We then read the file into memory with a stage file action. We then created a new schema file, a DAT file against that native schema, and this is the mapper that helped to map those values. Now we have a stage file action one more time, and we're simply using the zip operation. We need to create an archive of that worker DAT file. So take a look how that was configured. We chose the zip files operation, and here we specify that the name of the zip file, we could have just hard-coded it, but we just let them bring that in. That's one of those properties that we talked about before, that you can specify, what do I want to call my zip file that gets uploaded to the cloud, to the HCM cloud. And then a temporary directory to put it in. This is a VFS virtual file system directory where to store that zip file. All right, with that done, now we're ready to do our first invoke, and this is called send to UCM, but notice the type of this. This is the HCM cloud. So when we configured this invoke, and essentially what it's going to do is check that archive into the UCM. What it's going to do, we chose that action option. Notice all the other actions I can do on HCM Cloud. So this is simply the send files to HCM Cloud, where now I need to use the FA Fusion import export security group, the data loader import, and then if you'll notice, then it doesn't really have much other information other than, well, where's the file? Well, where's the file is in the mapping. So the mapper that got added to that invoke right here allows us then to define the doc type as document and then provide the name of the file. Remember that zip file name, so we're going to use that same name to pull it over there as to send to UCM. And the important part of it is, well, it needs a file. Where's the reference to the file? Well, we have the reference to the file, and so if you recall, on that zip response that we made in that stage file action, it returned a file reference to that zip file that we created, and that's where that mapping takes place. All right, so now we've sent to the UCM the file. Here we've configured, I'm not going to walk you through this, it's just an email notification. I'll just kind of quickly show you. We decided, all right, let's send an email to somebody letting them know that this pending workers file has been uploaded to the UCM, and here's a message to that effect. Later when we run this, you'll be able to see my email, see what this looks like, and how this is built is kind of tricky. If you'll notice, when you create the body of a message and you're referencing dynamic values, like in this case the file name, has been packaged to the zip file name. It has a content ID. Well, in order for those to work, we have to define file name to be the person's file name. We have to define the zip file name to be the zip file name that we have here. So we can't reference external we can't directly reference external properties or global variables or what have you. What we have to do is define them as parameters, file name, zip file name, content ID, and give them the values to where they belong to. All right, so that's how the notification action was configured. Next thing we're doing is we're going ahead and send the same zip file to the FTP server. Now, the reason we did this is just for demonstration purposes. In the real world, you may not need to do that, but you might need to archive it somewhere. So we made another call to the FTP server, and this time we're just going to send a copy of that archive. Let me click on continue by using the write file operation. And notice we didn't indicate the output directory, nor did we define the specific file name pattern. Right now we're gonna save that later on for when we do the mapping. So there was nothing to do on this invoke. We're simply going to write a file to some directory with some name. Notice how that gets handled. In the mapper, we come in here, and what we do is within the outbound FTP header type information, we provide the name of the file we wish to create. It's going to be that zip file name. And the directory we wish it to be placed in is, again, that integration property of what we're using for our FTP directory that we're going to populate later. And finally, the other thing we got to provide is, once again, the file reference, which is the same thing we saw before when we made the call to upload the UCM. The zip response from the stage file action provides that file reference to that file. All right, almost done. There were a lot of actions in here. Now that that has been sent to the FTP server, we go into a 2-minute delay, and I'll just show you how that's configured. It's pretty straightforward. We just provide the number of seconds to delay. We wait for 2 minutes, then we can make another invoke to the HCM cloud. This time, the invoke will be to initiate a loader operation. Let's take a look at how this was configured. Yeah, so this is loading it through to return content ID. We'll show you how that's configured in a moment. And notice this time it's a query create update delete operation that I wish to do on the adapter. And in this case, when we browse by services, we found the HCM data loader service to use, and the operation on that service is, in this case, the import and load data operation. All right, so with that selected, let's continue on. Here's a summary of that. Let's take a look at how the mapping was done. We didn't mean to make any changes, so let's discard that. So in the mapper that comes up, what it needs then are a couple of things. It needs the content ID, which essentially is, well, you uploaded something. Well, in that, when we sent to the UCM, the response we got back from the UCM provided the document name. So that's actually an ID. That ID is now being provided as what we want to be loaded, and then the parameter needed to indicate the import concurrent threads equal to 8. That's just a property that they need to specify how what kind of priority they're going to use for loading data. All right. The final thing we did after we uploaded it is to go ahead and create yet another email notification to the same admin email address. This time we simply indicate, yes, that the zip file, which we mapped as a parameter to the zip file name, containing the pending workers has been uploaded, and then we bring in the current time using a current time function, and we provide the job ID, which is the result. Let's quickly look at that, which is the result of that import response coming back. Alrighty, so if you've gone through and stepped through all this yourself to take a closer look, the warning is when you exit the integration, you want to discard any changes that you may have made because you didn't really want to edit it, you just wanted to look at it closely. All right, that ends this practice. We'll see you in the next video. All right, we reached practice 9-7, our last practice in this lab, and we got a little bit of work to do some setup as we activate and then test, monitor, and then we'll be doing a few extra steps to kind of validate that this worked in HCM Cloud. So I'll get started with these tasks here, where we're going to first activate the integration, then update some property values, and then from there we'll go and edit a unique persons file so that these can be uploaded into here. So let's work through those steps. Let me bring this out of our way. First things first, we need to activate the integration. Notice before it's activated, you can only view property values. Let's click Activate, choosing the debug tracing level. And once the banner confirms, as mentioned in the lab instructions, this can take a little bit longer than typical activations because we are working with a SaaS application on the other end. But I will click on refresh. Oh, and I waited long enough. So there we go. So it is now active. We can go now and notice under here, now it says update rather than view property values. So for the FTP directory, what we need to do is we need to provide a value that corresponds with where our FTP directory is. So let's refresh our memory. I created a directory under user1 called dm underscore aura001. So I need that full path here as well. So I'll copy and paste that into here. All right. And then for the email address, I'm going to use my email address. You would use yours, or an address that you have access to, I should say. And so we can see those notifications when they come in. Then I click on Submit. And if you want to validate that those are there, once again, when you click on Update, you should see those as now the current value. All right, so the next step is to prepare this file. And they talk about it here. We are going to have a couple of unique persons. Instead of John XX Brown and Susan XX Gray, we need to edit their names to be unique that will have never been put into the system. So I'm going to use, well, I was going to use my initials, but I've already used that for testing, so I'll use something a little bit different. But let me walk you through what's required there. First, I go to my resources folder. Let's find that XX persons XML file, and I'm going to edit it to provide for some unique initials. In fact, I'll put all three of my initials. I haven't used that before, and that will give me two unique persons to be added. So two persons to be added with those last names. Let's save that file. As JDM underscore persons, and we're all set. All right, that takes care of that task. The next thing it wants you to do is launch FileZilla again, or your FTP client, and put that file and locate it in that directory. So I'm going to do that now. Let's refresh my source location to find that JDM persons file. There it is, and we will upload it to that directory. All right, I'm going to delete this. This was from another test that I was doing a moment ago. So right now we just have that persons file coming in here. All right, next thing we need to do, following the lab instructions, so I'll bring those back up here, is go ahead and select to run the configuration. But before we can actually do the full run, we'll need to update two schedule parameter values. You'll see that when I demonstrate that. Let's go ahead and move this out of the way. Click on Run. And because it's a scheduled integration, it's showing you what the default values for these properties are, but we don't want that. We want something unique. So we want to change that to the value that will be brand new. Well, this is in my case, JDM will be brand new. And the persons file that I just uploaded is this one. So you'll do the same. Whatever persons file that you put on your FTP server, that's what this scheduled integration is going to be looking for, and provide some unique name for a worker file that hasn't, output file that hasn't been used over the HCM system. If you want to make it even more unique, you're concerned that someone else might have your initials, you can also append your or ID. The chances of the combination of that being the same would be highly unlikely. Okay, so now I'm going to click on Run. And when you click on Run, what happens is it queues it up to be for the scheduled integration to now execute, and immediately you can see it already started doing it. When you click on this instance ID, you can now actually monitor this in real time. If I scroll up, I can see it made it all the way very quickly to the wait action. If you recall, it's waiting for 120 seconds. So during the next couple of minutes while we're waiting for that time to elapse before we actually execute the import loaded data, we can do some other things. And so if you're looking at your lab instructions, one of the things it expects you to maybe try to do is see if your email has been received. So indeed mine has. I'm going to show you that the first email, that first notification that would have occurred way back, there it is, right here, to let us know that that happened, has been uploaded. Let me go ahead and show you that. There it is. So that unique person's XML file has been converted, which it has within the integration. We can look at the tracing. And then that JDM worker output file has been uploaded to UCM with a unique content ID. And of course, it reminds us that another confirmation email will come a little bit later. All right, let me pull this back out of the way. And let's discover over on FTP server, we should now, if we refresh, see that a copy of that zip file has been input into there. So let me refresh it. And sure enough, there's the JDM worker output file. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this over to my resources folder, because what we can do while we're waiting for this to finish is we can open up our resources section here that I've placed it in temporarily. There it is. And if we take a look at that file that we generated, let's go look at it here. Notice that this has been formatted now from the XML format to this native schema format of the delimited records. And sure enough, there's John JDM Brown and Susan JDM Gray. This is what's been a copy of what's been sent to Oracle HCM Cloud. All right, let's pull back out of here and let's now revisit our instructions. Let me kind of see where we are here. Yes, we've checked our FTP server. We've taken a look at the file. And now what we want to do is we want to log into the HCM Cloud application. The only thing I'll warn you about is it may take a little time for that data to show up over there. So before I go there, let's do one more thing. Let's go ahead and check to see if I got that second email. First, let's refresh here, because the integration should be over by now. Yes, it has. So it shows into a succeeded status, and it made it all the way to the end to include that last notification email. So when I check my email client, I can share that with you that indeed I got that second email that was sent. The zip file containing the workers has been loaded in the cloud at this timestamp, and there's a job ID which will correlate with a little bit later. So I'm going to pause the recording for just a moment, giving time for the HCM Cloud to pick up the information. When we return, we'll check, go ahead and navigate over to HCM Cloud application to verify the processing. And through the magic of pause and resume, it's been a couple of minutes, should be there by now. I'm going to now follow beginning in steps 22, what it looks like to navigate over to HCM Cloud. So let's move this out of our way. We're going to copy and paste that same URL we had on our Lab Info tab to navigate in to HCM Cloud using those same credentials. And actually, I didn't have to type them in this time because I was just there not too long ago. So my credentials, I should say my credentials, these credentials were already cached in my browser. I was able to go back there, but you'd be given a login page for you to log in. So according to the instructions, the first place we want to look is through the navigator. We want to go to My Client Groups, and we want to look at the data exchange information. So when we click on that page, if I look under Import and Load Data, what I'm hoping to see is my zip file. And sure enough, there it is. There's this last one I did, JDM worker output zip. Import status is successful. The load status is successful. And if you recall that content ID, which is corresponding to what we saw in that email. Whoops, let me click on this. If I click on this information and try to get it to load here, I can get more information about, let me refresh this. I can get more information. There's the full, there it is. There's the same number, 4287 of the content ID of this load. Now the second part of the double checking is I should have two new persons in the HCM Cloud. So to check on that, we navigate back out, go to My Clients Group, Person Management. This is all steps in the lab exercise. And let's search for them. Let's first look for JDM Brown. And there's JDM Brown with that information about that person. Let me open up his page. There we go. Which contains some information that we had populated from that request. Backing up here, I shouldn't have gone backwards here. And of course, I could do now the same thing for Susan Gray and find her information as well. We've already checked our emails. If I can double check our goal here is to see the zip file, to see the emails. We saw the contents of the of the conversion file, and at this point we're ready to wrap things up. So I'm going to go ahead and deactivate my integration. Before I do, let's just kind of summarize what we did here. We've took a already configured integration and set it up to be able to test and run the use case where it receives a file from the server, transforms it to the format, zips it up, sends it to HCM Cloud. We invoke a import and load operation to pull it in from UCM into the HCM Cloud. So right now I'll wrap up by deactivating my integration. As always, we don't want to leave things running if it's not necessary. Of course, with scheduled integrations, it's not as critical because they won't run unless you actually execute a schedule or you've defined a schedule. So let's back out of this. Oh, I'm sorry. There was one more thing I want to demonstrate. Under track instances, we should be able to see all the instances that have run recently. In addition to my JDM persons XML run that I just showed you, I had done a couple of preparatory things prior to that just to validate the configuration, which now allows me at any time to be able to go back in and see not only what we saw a moment ago, but I can go in and invoke, go in and take a look at all the messages that have been sent, including the responses I might have gotten back from, in this case, the HCM Cloud. All righty, let's go ahead and shut this down. Go to the design page. Then we go to deactivate. confirm it. And we'll close the banner and refresh our page. And this concludes Lab 9.